morning, everyone. I'm Sharon Pocalor, production editor of the World Happiness Report. Thank you for joining us today. A little bit of change of schedule just because we're running a bit late. I would like to say that Professor Sachs had to hop off just because he had a class to teach, but he wanted to welcome everyone to the WHR discussion that we have this morning. Today we'll have two of our editors that will be speaking on the World Happiness Report. We will have Professor Shun Wang that will talk about the framework of the World Happiness Report and social connections. And we'll have Professor Jan-Emmanuel De Neve, who is with you in person at Parma. And he will talk about the paper that he and Professor Sachs wrote that was recently published in Science Magazine. It's about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and its connection to human well-being. I'd like to have Professor Shun Wang first present. Please, Shun, thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be invited here to give a talk on the World Happiness Report. I'm the associate editor of the report. First, let me give you a brief introduction about World Happiness Report. It was started from about 10 years ago. A couple of scholars from the whole world gathered together to produce this kind of reports on the world happiness. So we want to study the distribution and also determinants of the happiness all over the world, so that to infer the policy, policymakers better to make the policies to improve their residents' happiness. Well, today I'm gonna mainly introduce the social environments for world happiness. In other words, I'm gonna talk about the importance of the social environment in determining the happiness distribution across countries. Well, this is mainly based on the chapter 2 of the World Happiness Report 2020. There are mainly two parts of contents I'm gonna share with you here. The first part is about how we measure the world happiness and what kinds of distribution of the current world happiness. And in the second part, I'm gonna introduce you the importance of the social environments for happiness. Well, happiness is like our self-perceived feelings of our own life or evaluation of our life. The main happiness measure used in our research or in a ranking of the world happiness is taken from the Gallup World Poll, which covers over 150 countries all over the world every year. Well, the main measure we use for ranking is called a country ladder. The survey questions is like this. Imagine a ladder with steps number from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. So the top means the best possible life for you, and the bottom means the worst possible life for you. So on which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? And we call this kind of measure as a life evaluations measure. In addition to this one, we also use the measures on our emotion or affect, which include the positive and negative affect, or positive and negative emotion. The country ladder is mainly used for the ranking and analysis because we found that the life evaluations measures are more correlated with our life environment. Well, probably you heard about some news and reports on the rankings of the country levels of happiness. Well, this is the recent ranking from the World Happiness Report 2020. We used the most recent 3 years data to calculate the average of the happiness scores in each nation. Well, from this figure, you can see the top 20. Well, the countries in the North Europe is always among the top. such as the Finland, Denmark, and Iceland, Norway, and Netherlands. So these countries are always on the top if you compare to the past waves. But the ranking will be slightly changed across years. But those Scandinavian countries are always on the top, among the top. Well, there are also some other countries like the New Zealand, Austria, Luxembourg, Canada, Australia who are also doing very well in terms of the happiness levels in their country. Well, the United States is also good, but much lower than the top 10 or top 5 countries. Well, in addition to the rankings, we also try to explain the distribution, the levels and the distributions of the world happiness. We use 6 measures to explain the levels. They are the GDP per capita, which is to measure the income level, because we know that income matters a lot for happiness. We also consider our health, which is measured by the healthy life expectancy. Well, in addition to these two objective measures of our life environment, we also consider 4 social variables, which are the social support, generosity, and freedom in their life, and also perception of corruption. Well, we decompose the levels of the happiness in each country into 6 components, which are explained by the 6 factors, respectively. So from the different, we have different colors on each bar. Well, the first one means the proportion explained by the GDP per capita. And the second one is the share explained by the social support. We can see that the importance of social support is even larger, or the contribution of the social support is even larger than the GDP per capita. So this tells us the importance of the non-economic factors in determining the happiness. We can also see that other social variables, such as the freedom and perception of corruption and generosity, also matters. And together, the share explained by them is also very big. Well, we also keep the last part is like the dystopia, which is like the worst scenario in all the 6 factors, plus the residual, which is unexplained by our model. So we see the rankings here. We also try to explain it by the 6 variables. Well, next I'm gonna briefly talk about the dynamics of the world happiness in recent years. We start to have the data from about 2006. So we show the dynamics of the country ladder from 2006 to 2019 for the whole world. And also we can show you the pattern of the negative effect. For the left panel, we show 3 figures which all show the dynamics of the country ladder, the main measure of happiness. But they are just weighted by different countries. Some are weighted by population, while some are not. The blue one, this one, is the population weighted. We can see that it's heavily affected by the 2009 financial crisis. Then since about 2012, it started to decrease until 2019. It's really bad because we see a downward sloping. Well, actually it's mainly caused by one big country, which is India. So because of a large population of India, so it will have a very big impact on the overall, global average of the happiness. If we do not consider the population weight, it's like we assign the same weight to each country. Well, the non-population weighted one have a very different pattern. We can see that since 2016, it kind of increased. Well, if we look at the negative effect, sadly, no matter whether we use population weight or not, we always see an increasing trend for the negative effect. The negative effect have 3 components, which includes the worry, anger, and sadness. So in other words, the whole world has experienced a rising negative emotion. in recent years. Well, next I'm going to show you the importance of the social supports, or the social environments in supporting our happiness. Well, we do this analysis both using the European Social Survey and the Gallup World Poll. So this table shows you the results in Europe. Well, there are many numbers here. Well, simply speaking, we just want to explain the happiness by a few risks in our life. For example, the discrimination, the ill health, the unemployment, low income, and the separated, divorced, and widowed, and also, whether you're afraid after the dark. So we can see the negative coefficient in the first column. That means all those risks lower our happiness. However, if people live in a society with a high social trust and high system trust, in other words, high trust in the government or the justice system, those good social environment may protect the risk, the negative impact of the risk. So may buffer the impact of the risks. So we can see in the last column, we show the percentage offset by the social trust and system trust. So even there is a risk which lower our happiness, but the social and institutional trust can buffer the negative happiness impact of the risk factors by a very large proportion, actually. You can see that if people live in a high social trust and system trust country, the negative impact of discrimination can be decreased by 44%. And we can see these kind of offside percentages, which shows the importance of the good social environment. And a similar effect can be found using the global data, the data from the Gallup World Poll. And we don't have the same set of variables, but still we can see that the good system trust can offset the negative impact of a couple of risks in our life. Well, then we use the European data to show the distribution of the happiness in kind of differing social environments. In the panel A, in the left panel, we show that the gray distribution shows that the happiness distribution for people living in a low trust society. And the green one shows people's happiness distribution for people living in a high trust society. High trust here means for high social and institutional trust. Well, clearly you can see that if people live in an environment with low trust, the level average of the happiness is lower. In addition, the dispersion is bigger. So that means if people live in a society with a high social and institutional trust, the average happiness is higher and have a lower inequality of happiness. Well, the second figure, which shows the importance of the social connections, the people's social connections. Well, similar story, although the impact of social connections is smaller than the political and social trust, but both can increase the average happiness and also lower the inequality. Well, then if we combine the two, we compare a society with a higher social connections and higher trust with low trust and a weak connections scenario. Well, the difference is more striking. So the green, distribution shows that people living in a high trust and with a strong connections have a much higher average happiness and much lower inequality. Well, in the last one, we compare with the real scenario with the hypothetical high trust society. The gray, the distribution in color gray, in the gray color, shows our real life. The average, we're using the average trust and the average social connections. We can see that the average levels of happiness is lower than the case of a high trust and strong connections. Well, so this is to show that it's not just money matters for our happiness. The social environment, including the trust and social connections, social network, all matters a lot. Well, in the last two slides, I'm going to briefly discuss a little bit about what happened during the pandemic, during COVID-19. This is also a very important topic for our next year's World Happiness Report. So we'll focus on the impact of the COVID-19 on people's happiness. Well, these data are based on the YouGov survey. We can show the dynamics, the changes in happiness during the COVID-19. So we have the data from March to July. We can show the dynamics of the people's happiness in those periods. Yeah. So the Brazil, Canada, and Mexico, and USA, you can see that their happiness is just not increased, and also just decreased in many months, because their changes is below zero. That means they are not increasing. But in many other Asia Pacific regions, we can see generally people's happiness are increasing since March and April, because the government may take a strong action to deal with the infection. Well, in Europe, we can see also in the beginning, in April, people's happiness was kind of decreasing because the increase rate is negative. But in May, it's much better. However, in June and July, then there is not much increase in happiness anymore. So that means people are kind of still worried again. But this is kind of consistent with the government action and the actual infection. But still, we can take the data from the YouGov. And here we have two measures about people's perception. And the first one is about perception of government handling. That means, are you confident about government handling of the COVID-19? The second panel shows people's confidence in their health authorities in dealing with the COVID-19. Well, we compare the different countries. We can see that the USA, Mexico are doing very bad. That means a lot of people are not confident about the government handling of the COVID-19. Well, their confidence in the health authorities is also very low in the United States, in Mexico, and so in those countries. And also in a couple of European countries such as France, also very low. But if you look at the Asia Pacific, like Vietnam, and Malaysia, and Taiwan, Singapore, generally the people are kind of confident, about the government handling, and also confident about in their health authorities in many Asia Pacific countries. So we can see that the institutional trust, particularly the trust in the health authorities, really is linked with the performance and also matters for people's happiness. Well, we will do more research and hope to share you more research outputs in next year about our study on the COVID-19 and happiness. Anyway, I just want to briefly show you the importance of the social environment for happiness. All right, thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Shun. I think you can stop sharing your screen at the moment.
All right.
Thank you very much, Shun, for giving us the framework of the World Happiness Report and also the current data that we're actually as a team working on in terms of COVID-19 and so forth. So I guess there's a little introduction that our 2021 theme, of course, will be COVID and how we're coping with COVID and how the data is showing us and how social trust and so forth. I'd like now to move to Professor Jan-Emmanuel De Neve, who will talk about one of the central chapters in the World Happiness Report, dealing with the SDGs and human well-being. Of course, very connected to what we're talking about through this whole session and this whole conference at Regeneration 2030, really linking that the SDGs and human well-being are very imperative. So Jan, please take the lead. And good morning and good afternoon.
Thank you, Sharon. And good afternoon, everyone here in Parma. and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone tuning in from wherever you may be. Thanks also to Shun, who is an associate editor of the World Happiness Report, for laying out the important research ongoing for the World Happiness Report and how COVID-19 is impacting our well-being from a variety of angles. I myself am a co-editor of the World Happiness Report, and for the 2020 report, Jeffrey Sachs and I set out to do something what I think is rather exciting and very relevant for the conference here on regeneration, which is to bring together sustainable development and human well-being. And we're particularly excited about doing so because it brings together two very important streams of thinking, but also two important streams of data. The Sustainable Development Goals are being measured through the SDG index, and world happiness is being measured through the Gallup data that we use in the World Happiness Report. So for the first time, we brought these two big data sets together and look at how the interaction and the dynamic is of the two. So this is joint work with Jeff, who will hopefully join us after I speak, and then also for the next session. You will remember, if you were here in Parma or were listening in earlier on, this is the main result of is very basic but very powerful. It shows that there is a strong positive correlation between doing well on the SDGs and happy populations. But as already noted earlier on, the real insight is that it is a convex relationship. That is, as one increases and further advances in terms of sustainable development, it increasingly returns in terms of well-being. So just in case, if you're seeing this slide for the first time, then on the horizontal axis is how well a country does in terms of sustainable development, as measured through the SDSN SDG index. On the vertical axis is the average score for a population in terms of their well-being. And their well-being, as Shun already explained earlier on, is measured by asking people the question whether they're satisfied with their lives. And so it's a true measure of how people feel about their lives, and you can tell that there's this very strong correlation. I also want to point out that this convex relationship is very different from what you would find if you just look at traditional GDP measures. So if we were to look at well-being on GDP rather than sustainable growth, you'd find a concave relationship. That is to say, diminishing returns to growth. And that is exactly what we're obviously seeing in our societies today, is that growth for the sake of growth is no longer translating into further well-being. So societies who may have doubled or even tripled their GDP in the last decade or two will not necessarily have seen equivalent increases in well-being. What we find from this work is that the only way for wealthy industrialized nations to continue to improve in well-being, it has to go through sustainable development, and hence the importance of regenerative action. Now, this is what I showed you is just a general result. But the SDGs, there's 17 of them. And so the story becomes more intricate and more sophisticated, I think, once you delve into the 17 SDGs. Because most people think of sustainable development, but that is a whole host of important actions, ranging from improving health, access to education, environment and climate action, but also inequalities and a number of other important goals that the world has set itself. If you look at the individual relationship between each SDG and how it relates to people's well-being, as they self-report in each country, you find that generally it's very positive, just like the general correlation showed you. In fact, items such as health and industry and peace and institutions are very clearly very important for well-being. But if you look carefully, you'll see that there's two SDGs that somewhat surprisingly are actually negatively correlated with well-being. And those happen to be the ones that have to do with the environment. So it's SDG 12 and SDG 13. SDG 12 is responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13 is climate action. And so this shows you that while people appreciate a clean environment and to be responsible in both consumption and production, the policies to get there are not that easy for people. So for example, I'll give you an anecdotal example. When people in Italy or the UK or Belgium had to change their shopping patterns from now having to bring in their own shopping bags rather than receiving them in the shop, That is responsible consumption. But that wasn't easy for most people. It required a change in their behavior, which in a short term at least, reduces their quality of life to some extent. Now, obviously, people appreciate the outcome of these policies, but I think these data show you that there's some tensions and challenges, that if we want to improve, whether you're a business or an individual, the environment, it comes at certain costs to our current way of living. When I'm thinking of some of the amazing businesses that represent the conference now, you'll see that they've made investments into becoming sustainable. Whether you're Illy or Davide at Davines, you find that there's investments that need to be made. These are painful sometimes, but they come with payoffs in the long run. I'll give you a final example of where I think these tensions are showing. When you look at Greta Thunberg or the Extinction Rebellion movement, they're making a very clear case for doing well for the environment, and they're absolutely right. But we should not forget, for example, les gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, social movements that came out on the streets to express their discomfort after the introduction of a carbon tax. For those of you who may not recall, the Gilets jaunes in Paris in France came out on the streets after there was an extra fuel duty, I think, on diesel. Why is that? That's pro-environment policies, but they reduce the immediate quality of life, the comforts of the status quo. And so what I find personally so beautiful is that in these data, you see this tension between climate action or responsible consumption production and immediate well-being. And the result of this is, I believe that policymakers and business leaders need to think very creatively to deal and compensate and work with these tensions to try and get through to responsible consumption production without necessarily antagonizing some parts of society or some part of their workers. And that's the real challenge, I think, to make sure that everybody moves towards that positive curve. Now, we can look into a bit more detail because it's true, the negative result on SDG 12 and SDG 13 are probably the most interesting. The one that stands, even if you push the data a bit further, is SDG 12. So responsible consumption and production is the most difficult SDG to realize from a well-being perspective. SDG 13, climate action, we find, is somewhat the result also of if you are a wealthier country, you're doing more carbon emissions, and that's why there's a bit of an issue. But SDG 12, I think, is a real challenge within the SDG framework if we want to link SDGs with well-being. I'll conclude with this final slide, which shows you the traditional 17 SDGs and their color scheme. But the beautiful aspect of putting well-being on top of everything is that it then allows you to look for the relative importance of each one of the SDGs in driving well-being. So at this conference on regeneration, we're linking well-being and sustainability, and one of the advantages of doing so is that we can then use the well-being statistics to look at where to prioritize which SDGs if we want to maximize the well-being of populations. And so you find that all the SDGs are important, but some are more important than others if the goal is to maximize well-being. And so I think this is a step up or a step forward in terms of thinking around the SDGs because it gives very precise policy guidance to business leaders and policymakers, generally speaking. And we can do this for the world, like the slide you see behind me, or we can do this by regions or even by country or even within a company. I think there are possibilities of looking at life satisfaction or job satisfaction of employees and looking at the relative importance of the drivers of these. I'm going to conclude on this and happy to hand it back to Sharon or any questions that there may be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. I noticed that there was one question, where can we get a copy of the data? The data is actually for the World Happiness Report and rankings. They're actually available at worldhappiness. I think it's just World Happiness Report, actually, worldhappiness.report. If you are asking about the new data that we have with YouGov on COVID, the COVID effects, I can share that link with you in the chat box. Before we move on, are there any questions from the actual in-person audience before we go to any questions online? This is open to everyone who is in the audience or online. There are a few hundred people online that I see. And this is your opportunity to talk to the editors of the WHR. So please do send your questions. But I'm going to actually ask a question now for the editors, since we've been working with each other. So our 2021 report will focus on COVID, of course. In the trends that, Shun, that you mentioned, how is it having a negative effect? How are the countries varying? Do you see any connections or correlations with countries that have been able to contain COVID-19 versus countries who have not? And is it affecting their well-being? I mean, you can only share what the data has.
I think, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can.
Well, we haven't, started the issues carefully yet, and we are still working on that. But just look at the dynamics, the data of the YouGov, and we do see something there. The countries who are heavily affected and or which are not well, dealt with the COVID-19. People's happiness are kind of affected and not recovered yet. And we also, these days, we are preparing for one chapter of next year's report. And we mainly focus on the East Asian experience because we know some Asia Pacific countries have done a relatively better job. We do see that in the early period, like March and April and February, there has been a negative impact on people's emotion. Well, these days, and it's largely kind of recovered, like in countries like China and some other East Asian countries. So I do feel that there is a very big impact on people's, happiness these days. And the infection rate and death rate and all those measures are correlated with people's emotion. But of course, it's very difficult and hard to get enough data on people's happiness during the pandemic. So we actually use the data like from the Google search and also like from some China version of the Twitter to, infer people's emotion. And it's not a perfect index, but we can tell something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shun. Am I muted? Thank you very much, Shun. Jan, I know a lot of your work focuses on work. And do you see in your current research on the well-being of workers or people in terms of COVID-19 in that, is it people are working from home and, children are at home and so forth. Is there any correlations that you're seeing in the current data and how COVID-19 is affecting the workforce?
Thank you, Sharon. So just to be sure everybody's understood the question, or the way I at least understood it, is the impact essentially of COVID-19 on work and what that means for people's well-being. And I first want to make a point, building on what Shun was saying. Something that really struck me looking at the well-being statistics, especially for the UK and other places during COVID, is how incredibly sharp the drop was in March. So late February, early March, before the lockdowns. That's when you saw the biggest drop in well-being. And so there was lots of anxiety in society and uncertainty about the future, and that's when you saw the biggest drop. In fact, I think even the biggest drop on record, historically speaking, on a well-being scale. Now, strikingly is, as soon as the lockdown came in the UK, this was the 23rd of March, we were a bit later than the average country in the European Union, that halted, it stopped the fall in well-being. So a lot of people think that it's the lockdowns that make people unhappy, but we should never forget it's COVID, it's the uncertainty of the virus that really drives the negative impact on well-being. And the lockdowns, at least the original one, actually help stabilize the situation and give people a new sense of normal. Not as great as the old normal, but at least a new normal to which people can adapt and look and adapt and anticipate. And so, while today we're still lower in terms of well-being than we were at the same time last year, we've already recovered quite a bit of the well-being drop that took place when COVID-19 really hit the European nations. And a lot of the negative hit on well-being came through work, people's stress and anxiety about potentially losing their job. And I think if COVID-19, if there's one message coming out of the impact of COVID-19 on the workplace, it's the inequalities have been exacerbated. So people with not so great jobs, self-employed, freelance, say you're working at a Pret lunch place, or you work for Uber as a driver, people with already a whole host of, on the wrong side of inequality, that kind of inequality was exacerbated. Same thing with people in essential jobs. What we've now started calling essential jobs are essentially the jobs that aren't necessarily the best paid to begin with. And so you see that white-collar, blue-collar divide was also exacerbated. So people in white-collar jobs, typically stable jobs, employees, et cetera, well-salaried, they were able to go and work from home and continue, whereas people more of the blue-collar job type lost their jobs, or their pay was put under pressure, or they had to go into furlough schemes, as was the case in the UK. So I think if there's one thing that we've really noticed is the exacerbation of inequalities. So prior to COVID-19, a lot of people were talking about addressing inequality. I'm afraid that the whole COVID-19 situation has set us back at least a few years in terms of addressing basic inequalities in society.
Thank you, John. We have about 5 minutes left with our session, and I see there are a few questions. I'll read 2 questions, and Shun and Jan, you can answer them both. I think they relate to the research that you both do. So one is, and I guess this is for Shun, why negative emotions are growing in recent years with the data that you showed. And also, I guess both of you can actually answer this question or actually go further or talk about the studies in it. Can well-being frameworks help address the recent polarization in political views and addressing inequality? I know both of you have touched on that. Shun, would you like to go first about why negative emotions are growing in recent years?
Well, that's a very, very good question. Well, when we show the dynamics, and we are also very surprised to see the rapid increase of the negative emotion in recent years. Well, when we see the dynamics of the country ladder, and we can figure out that, okay, it's mainly caused by large countries such as India, and also United States have contributed a little bit to the decline in the life evaluations measured by country ladder. Well, for the negative emotion, well, we didn't explore it in details. Well, it seems like it's not just caused by some specific countries. There are many parts of the world has been experiencing such kind of increase. I guess it can be related with a lot of uncertainties and conflicts in the world. Like, we know there are regional conflicts. There are also domestic conflicts in many countries, like the populist. Well, but this is a very important topic to be further explored in the future. But currently, I cannot give you a very, very concrete answer right now, very unfortunately. Maybe Jan can give a better explanation for that. I'm not sure.
Maybe a few points. And Sharon, it's not always easy to perfectly understand the question being asked because the connection maybe not be that good. But I want to emphasize an important point that Shun made and that you may not have fully picked up on in the data, which is that in the last decade, when we started the World Happiness Report, and we look at where well-being was when we started in 2012, and we look at well-being statistics today, we find that well-being as measured through life satisfaction has sort of stabilized and come down a little bit. But if you look at negative emotions, they're off the charts, they've increased. And to me, this is really disturbing, not just because it's disturbing, but also because it's against the backdrop of economic growth and low unemployment. The last measures were taken before COVID, just to be clear. But so if you look from, say, 2006 to 2019, the latest data from Gallup, you find that we've seen an increase worldwide, on average, of about 20% in negative emotions. And that's expressed through worry, stress, and anger. These are the types of emotions that we can pick up. So think about this for a second. So since the financial crisis, where employment has come up and there has been material growth, people have somehow become more stressed, more worried, and more anxious about their lives by a margin of about 20% globally. Some countries more, some countries a bit less. That, to me, is really striking. And I think a call, an alarm bell, a call to action, and including the one that we have here at Regeneration 2030. In part, what could explain this? In part, I think it's people are scared about the future of work. So what we see as economists is lots of changes in the way that production and industry is being organized, artificial intelligence, you name it. For the vast majority of people, these productivity gains are not necessarily going to mean better jobs or more income. We'll probably see wage polarization, more pressures onto people's day-to-day efforts, less social capital in the workplace. Your boss may become an algorithmic platform. Like if you're working for Uber, you don't have a boss, you just have an algorithm that bosses you around. And I think most people look forward and see that there isn't that much to look forward to. And that, I think, is already anticipated in some of the stresses, the worry item that we see is rising worldwide. And so for me personally, the policy lesson to be drawn from this is when politicians and business leaders project out a future, it needs to be a positive future, one where technology is put to good use and allows for better quality jobs, and not necessarily just drive people out of jobs or make their jobs less qualitatively good. So I think that's partially to help explain why we see that dramatic increase in worry and stress and anger in the world.
Thank you very much, Jan and Shun. We've come to the conclusion of our session. However, we invite everyone to join us for the SDH session, which is the Science and Ethics for Happiness session, which is all the same players the editors of the WHR are also involved in. Thank you very much for this conversation with our editors. We hope to see you on our next webinar and also have a further dialogue in Regeneration 2030. These pieces of information will help promote the dialogue even further virtually and there in Parma about making sure that the underlying purpose of well-being is set forth in anything what we're doing in regenerating. So thank you, everyone, and see you soon in another session.